Before the late 1700s, most scholars thought that the layered rocks of the Earth were deposited by Noah's flood. There were several attempts at a broad-scale history of strata of the Earth, but nothing detailed or based on empirical examination of real rock outcrops or their fossils. As early as 1719, William Strachey created one of the first true geologic cross-sections. He projected coal seams from active coal mines in his area in the Somerset coalfield just south of Bath, England, and interpreted how they plunged into the ground and how deep the mines needed to be to reach them. But no one followed up on these ideas until a young surveyor by the name of William Smith was hired to work on those same coalfields in 1791, some 72 years later. William Smith came from humble origins. Born in 1769 in the Oxfordshire village of Churchill, his father was an illiterate blacksmith, and Smith became an orphan at 8 years old and went to live with his uncle. He was an avid fossil collector, picking up pundips, or fossil brachiopods that were used like in marbles and games, and poundstones, fossil sea urchins that were used for pound weights for balancing butter scales. But instead of becoming a poor, illiterate farm worker like the rest of his peers, Smith's intelligence and industry were noted by a surveyor, Edward Webb, who took him on as an apprentice and taught him the trade of surveying. Then, at age 22, he was hired in the Somerset coalfield to survey the rocks and predict the outcrops of coal, like Strachey had done 7 decades earlier. Soon his skills were on demand. He was hired to survey the route of the Somerset Coal Canal, where he lived in a house in Tucking Mill, just south of Bath. The Industrial Revolution was going full steam in the late 1790s, and the old roads were too rough and rutted to be a good way to transport heavy wagon loads of coal to the iron fields. So England invested in major efforts to build canals across the landscape, which would transport these heavy loads cheaply and efficiently to where they were needed. Ironically, a few decades later, the railroads came along and made these canals obsolete, so now they're used for pleasure boaters. As Smith surveyed the canal excavations, he was one of the first people to see a fresh cut through the bedrock of western England. Fresh bedrock outcrops are scarce in England, where the rainy climate means that only exposed rocks occur in beach cliffs and quarry faces and a few road cuts. Not only did Smith get the first good look at the sequence of rock units in southwestern England, but he was an avid collector of fossils as the canals were dug, and soon realized that every formation he surveyed had its own distinct assemblage of fossils, and the formations and their fossils occur in a predictable sequence. When he visited collections of some of the rich gentlemen in the Geological Society of London, he would amaze them with his ability to identify their fossils and tell them exactly what rock unit they had come from. He developed the principle of faunal succession, showed that fossils occur in a predictable sequence that can be used to identify and date formations. This is the foundation of modern biostratigraphy, the study of the sequence of fossils in rocks. It's the fundamental tool for dating rocks even 200 years after Smith. As artist Ray Troll showed in his humorous cartoon, the data are in the strata. Smith began to develop a stratigraphic column for all these distinctive rock units and gave them interesting names such as the blue lias, the shales of beef, the black fen marls, the green ammonite beds, cornbrash, coralline group, inferior oolite, and forest marble. After finishing his work on the Somerset Canal, he was hired as a surveyor in many other parts of England, where he soon began mapping the formations and their fossils across a large area. By 1815, he had created the first ever true geologic map, which covered all of England, Wales, and parts of southern Scotland. In his biography of William Smith, author Simon Winchester calls it the map that changed the world. Geologic maps are the fundamental tool for all of geology, not only to understand where the different rock units occur, but how they might occur under the surface as well. Without geologic maps, it would be impossible to find most of Earth's resources, especially oil and coal and many minerals. And without geologic maps, it's impossible to determine the geologic history of a region, which you patch together to understand the geologic history of the Earth. Smith's map was so accurate it can still be used today, and it closely matches the modern geologic map of England. Meanwhile, other geologists were taking his discovery and making their own reputations from it, since Smith had not published and established his priority. In addition, Smith suffered from the prejudice of wealthy, class-conscious gentlemen geologists of his time, who viewed him as a lowly working man, as all engineers and surveyors were then considered. Most of them did geology as a hobby, not a vulgar way to make a living. Smith was one of the few who might be considered professional geologists, and that he worked on geologic problems for an income. The idea of faunal succession was so powerful that it soon emerged in France. Baron Georges Cuvier, the first great anatomist and paleontologist, and mollusk expert Alexandre Brongniart had mapped the strata of the Paris Basin, and eventually recognized their own sequence of French rocks and fossils. Some say that Brongniart may have heard of Smith's ideas during a visit to England in 1806, although the French insist they came up with the idea on their own. Whatever the truth, the idea of faunal succession was definitely in the air at that time. In 1817, Smith took his map and drew a remarkable cross-section all the way across the southern tier of England and Wales. It stretched from the ancient rocks of Mount Snowdonia in northern Wales at one end to the very young Eocene rocks beneath London on the other. This was the first time someone had drawn a geologic cross-section on such a large scale and shown that the sequence of rocks across England had a regular, repeatable pattern that was easy to understand and represented a tilted package of rock layers. Today, we point to places like the Grand Canyon to show this idea, but Smith was the first to demonstrate it. Although Smith himself never engaged in philosophical speculation about what it meant, it was the basis for a classic geologic column and timescale that is now familiar to all of us. Other scholars of that time, such as Georges Cuvier and Alexandre d'Orbigny in France, tried to reconcile the complex pattern of dozens of different faunal levels through time with the actual rock record. The idea that all the world's rocks could be explained by a single creation event and a single Noah's flood was rapidly being undermined. D'Orbigny went so far as to suggest there had been 29 separate creation events not described in the Bible. Clearly, the old notion of Noah's flood was being demolished as geologists actually mapped and documented the real sequence of rocks for the first time. Unfortunately, other people had no qualms about plagiarizing Smith's work and publishing cheap knockoffs of his detailed map, so Smith made almost no money from it. Eventually, he got into debt when his maps didn't sell well, and his out-of-pocket expenses mapping all of England caught up with him. Smith went to debtor's prison in 1819 because of his financial problems. When he was finally released, he found that he had lost his home of 14 years and all his property had been seized. He scratched out a living as an itinerant surveyor until one of the men who employed him back in his better years, Sir John Johnstone, found out about his plight. Johnstone gave him full-time work in his estates in Scarborough in Yorkshire, where Smith not only improved his mapping of eastern England, but developed the Rotunda, a museum dedicated to the geology of the Yorkshire coast. It is the oldest purpose-built museum in Britain. It was built as a tall, round tower, according to Smith's design suggestions, and the original displays of fossils illustrate his ideas. The fossils and rocks were arranged in the order which they occurred, with the youngest in the cases at the top and the oldest at the bottom. The order around the walls reflects the order of rocks in the Yorkshire coast. That museum is still popular today, although modernized and upgraded in the past 180 years. In 1831, toward the end of his life, Smith was finally given credit for all his groundbreaking work. He was awarded the first Wollaston Medal by the Geological Society in London. The president of the society, Adam Sedgwick, famous professor of geology at Cambridge University, called him the father of English geology. In 1835, he was surprised by an honorary doctorate at Trinity College in Dublin, and King William IV gave him a royal pension of £100 a year. In 1838, he was appointed one of the commissioners who would select the site for the new Palace of Westminster. He died at age 70 in 1839 and was buried near where he passed away in Northampton. His grave is still visible at the churchyard of St. Peter's Church in Merrifair. More importantly, his discovery of the principle of faunal succession was the foundation for telling geologic time, as Smith also drew the first geologic column for an entire region. His development of the first geologic map was a fundamental tool of all geology ever since, literally the map that changed the world.